Rylan Voss gripped the console tightly, watching the screen blink with incoming data. The Vraxii fleet had just entered Earth's orbit, and at first glance, everything seemed peaceful. The incoming transmission, a diplomatic communique, promised nothing but goodwill, peace, and advancement. It was an offer for a partnership. But Rylan had learned long ago that the first sign of peace was often the calm before the storm, and today the storm was about to hit with a force no one expected. "Command, this is not right." "There's something wrong," Rylan muttered to himself, his voice low but urgent. As Earth's tactical command leader, it was his job to be the first to see the cracks. But he hadn't expected to see this. His eyes scanned the incoming message. The Vraxii were offering technology, resources, alliances. Everything Earth had fought for in the past century. How could such an opportunity be anything but a blessing? Then, the warning lights flared red across the screen. Before he could react, a tremendous explosion rattled the ship beneath him. Earth's airwaves burst into chaos, communication systems failing in an instant. The Vraxii, who had presented themselves as emissaries of peace, had unleashed their first strike. A wave of destruction slammed into Earth's defenses. Satellites crashed from orbit, cities disintegrated into dust, and humanity's most advanced technology became useless. The Vraxii had come not as friends, but as invaders. And their first move? Eradication. "All ships, all stations are offline, sir. We've lost contact with all planetary defenses," one of Rylan's subordinates shouted from across the room, his voice tight with panic. Rylan's eyes locked onto the projection of Earth on the screen, which was already beginning to burn. The Vraxii had come under the guise of alliance, only to reveal their true mission: subjugation. The image flickered, showing the first Vraxii forces landing, their armored ships descending into Earth's most populous cities, like vultures closing in on their prey. They betrayed us." "The bastards!" Rylan's voice was barely a whisper, but in that moment it carried all the weight of the Earth's doomed future. The lie had been exposed. The Vraxii were not here for peace. They were here to conquer, enslave, and harvest everything humanity had worked for. The battle was not just one of military might. It was about survival. The human race was staring into the abyss of extinction, and Rylan knew it was his responsibility to stop the fall. "Prepare for impact. Evacuate civilians in the zone immediately," Rylan barked, his voice sharper now. He tore his eyes away from the screen, his hands shaking from both adrenaline and disbelief. He knew what had to be done, but the realization of what Earth was facing began to settle on him like a cold weight. Humanity had trusted the Vraxii. Now, Earth would pay the price. As Rylan's mind raced, the cities beneath him were already under fire. The Vraxii's forces had landed with brutal precision. Shock waves rippled through the air as the first wave of explosions tore apart buildings, scattering human lives into chaos. Rylan didn't hesitate. He turned to his team, his tactical command staff, already beginning to regroup. "Get every remaining signal out. I need eyes on the battlefield. The Vraxii will regret this mistake," Rylan said, his voice cutting through the disarray like a blade. But the damage was done. The Vraxii were ruthless. They had not only crippled humanity's defenses, but they had torn through the very heart of Earth's resistance with no regard for what had come before. In one swift, brutal act, the Vraxii shattered Earth's sense of safety and hope. But in that moment, something else sparked in Rylan. A flicker of anger. A glimmer of resolve. The Vraxii may have attacked, but Rylan Voss wasn't ready to lie down and accept defeat. He had seen this before, the overwhelming odds, the unbeatable forces, and somehow, humanity had always found a way. This time would be no different. The invasion had begun, but it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. "Rally the troops. We'll strike back, no matter what," Rylan snapped, his voice steady now, focused. The shock of betrayal still churned in his gut, but his instincts had taken over. Earth had been betrayed, yes, but the Vraxii had underestimated humanity. And that mistake would cost them. The next few moments were a blur. Rylan was already on his feet, barking orders, rallying the troops. His team scrambled to assess the damage, but it was clear that Earth's first line of defense had failed. The cities had fallen and the Vraxii had taken control of the skies. Yet Rylan wasn't done. Yet. This battle, this war, was far from over. From behind, a voice called out, "Commander, what do we do now?" Rylan didn't even need to think. His answer was instinctive. "Now, we make them regret ever stepping foot on Earth." And that's when it hit him. The realization that in order to survive, humanity would have to use what the Vraxii didn't understand. Creativity, adaptability, and psychological warfare. Earth's strength wasn't in its armies or its technology, but in its ability to improvise, to evolve. The Vraxia had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt. They had betrayed the wrong species, and as the first human resistance cells began to form across the planet, Rylan knew the next phase of the war would be a fight they would never expect. The struggle for Earth's survival had just begun, and the Vraxii would soon regret ever trying to conquer it. The smoke from the burning cities lingered in the air, thick and acrid, marking the brutal aftermath of the Vraxii's first strike. Humanity, reeling from the sudden and violent betrayal, had lost much of its hope. The Vraxii had descended like a storm, crushing everything in their path. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, there was a flicker of something else. Something humanity had been built on for millennia. It wasn't just survival, it was defiance. Rylan Voss stood at the ruins of what had once been a strategic command center, the remnants of the human military's last stand. The disarray around him mirrored the turmoil inside his mind. The battlefield, littered with wreckage and the wounded, was a grim reminder of how quickly the tide had turned against Earth. But something else was happening too. In the midst of it all, the will to fight back was stirring. Resistance had begun, not in the form of grand armies or advanced weaponry, but in small pockets of survivors who had yet to bow to their invaders. "Rylan!" Relic Dean's voice cut through the smoke, bringing Rylan back to the present. The veteran strategist was standing over a map, marking out potential rally points for the survivors. "We have to act fast. They're not waiting for us to regroup. Vraxii forces are already pushing further into the city." "I know," Rylan replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision ahead. "But we can't fight them head on. We don't have the resources and we don't have the numbers." Rollick's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll outsmart them. The Vraxii are predictable. They'll make the same mistakes they always make, underestimating us." Rylan looked at the makeshift resistance flag they had hastily raised above the ruins, the symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. It was all they had now. They couldn't match the Vraxii's superior firepower, but they could use what they had: human ingenuity, strategy, and an unrelenting will to survive. "Gather the others," Rylan ordered. "It's time to start fighting back." Gravik's son, a former special ops soldier with a knack for unconventional warfare, arrived with his team shortly afterward. His face, usually stoic, betrayed the weight of the task ahead. He clutched a portable communication device, still operational despite the Vraxii's attempts to sever humanity's lines. "I've got something for you, Commander," he said, passing the device over. "What is it?" Rylan asked, squinting at the readout. "I hacked their comms," Graver replied, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "We've got access to their transmissions now. Let's make them think we're everywhere." Rylan studied the device, a new idea beginning to form. "Perfect. We'll make them paranoid." Fisk, the outsider with a mysterious background in alien tech, joined them shortly after. Unlike the others, Fisk was no soldier, but his expertise in alien systems had already proven invaluable. He adjusted the settings on his device, his hands quick and practiced. "We can reverse their energy readings," Fisk said. "We'll overload their sensors. They won't know what hit them." Rylan nodded. The Vraxii were technologically superior, but they had one major flaw: complacency. They believed their technology made them untouchable. That arrogance would be their downfall. The next few hours were a blur of strategy and action. Rylan's team moved swiftly, coordinating small-scale sabotage missions throughout the city. They used their knowledge of the terrain, turning urban areas into deadly traps for the Braxii. They disabled alien tech, hacked into communication grids, and left behind misleading signs to confuse the Braxii forces. It was guerrilla warfare at its finest, not a direct confrontation but an assault on the Vraxi's confidence. "On my mark, we'll trigger the blast," Gravik said, standing behind a barrier of overturned vehicles. His team was in position, and the Vraxii forces were on the move. Rylan crouched low, watching the enemy advance. He could see their heavily armored soldiers, their arrogance evident in the way they strutted through the streets, unaware that they were walking into a carefully set trap. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was calm. This was it. This was the moment that would define their resistance. "Mark," Rylan whispered. Gravik activated the device. In an instant, a blinding flash erupted from the street corner ahead, sending Vraxi soldiers scattering in all directions. The blast wasn't enough to destroy them, but it was enough to disrupt their coordination, enough to create chaos in their ranks. The Vraxi were stunned, their superior tech momentarily short-circuiting from the power surge. "Move out," Rylan shouted. His team sprang into action, striking while the Vraxii were disoriented. Human soldiers, now emboldened by their small victory, surged forward, taking out key targets and securing vital locations. For the first time since the invasion began, the Vraxii were forced to retreat, their systems struggling to adapt to the unexpected. "Did we do it?" Rollick asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "We made them blink," Rylan replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But this is just the beginning. We've shown them that we're not just targets. We're not just pawns in their game." The small victory didn't erase the losses humanity had suffered, but it was a start. The resistance was no longer just a group of scattered survivors. It was a movement. And Rylan had just proven that, against all odds, humanity could fight back. However, the Vraxi were not so easily deterred. They would retaliate, of course. But Rylan knew something they didn't. Humanity's strength lay not in technology, but in its resourcefulness, its ability to adapt to any situation. It was this quality that the Vraxi had overlooked, and it would be their undoing. As the team regathered, Rylan felt a weight lifting from his chest. For the first time, he believed in their chances. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a war for their freedom. And he was ready to lead them to victory. "We've made our mark," Rylan said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But we've only just begun. The Vraxi will regret underestimating humanity." The morning after their first victory, Rylan stood on a ridge overlooking the remnants of a Vraxi encampment. It was a small win, a raid on a supply depot, but it had sent a ripple through the Vraxi ranks. The humans had outsmarted them, and now the enemy was beginning to feel it. The attack wasn't about the firepower or the scale. It was about making the Vraxi question themselves. The human resistance was not simply surviving, it was learning how to strike with precision, to create confusion, and to turn every small advantage into a foothold. "Commander," said Rollick Den, joining Rylan on the ridge. "They're starting to pull back from their forward positions. They've just moved half their forces to a more secure location." "They're regrouping," Rylan muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the Vraxi would do this. They had to. What they didn't know was that Rylan had anticipated it. "Rolik, we've got them," he said, a fire igniting in his chest. "If we push now, they'll be forced into a corner. Let's give them a show they'll never forget." Rylan's mind worked quickly, thinking of their next move. He knew the Vraxi were confident, perhaps too confident. They'd underestimated the resilience of the human spirit. But it wasn't just human resilience they were facing. It was ingenuity, cunning, and psychological warfare. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology, it was their ability to adapt and turn the tables, to outthink the Vraxi at every turn. Gravik's son, one of Rylan's most trusted soldiers, approached with a grim smile. "The decoys are set, Commander. Everything's in place." "Good," Rylan said, turning to face him. "Let's make this look convincing. We're going to feed them exactly what they want to see." The plan was simple. Too simple for the Vraxii to believe it could work. They would simulate a direct assault on a strategically significant city, luring the bulk of the Vraxii forces into a trap. Meanwhile, Ryland's real objective was to strike where it would hurt the most: their supply lines. "Rallick, get the others ready. We move out in 1 hour," Ryland commanded. As the team prepared, Ryland couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something bigger. The Vraxii had spent too much time focusing on their technological superiority, dismissing humanity as weak and unworthy of serious consideration. They had failed to see the depth of human strategy, the way a well-placed distraction could bring down even the mightiest empire. The hours leading up to the attack were tense, but Ryland's resolve never wavered. They had to make this work. The Vraxii had to believe they were facing a human force too desperate to be anything but reckless. When the time came, the Vraxii would act, and that would be their undoing. The decoys were launched, fake transmissions sent across the Vraxii communication channels, and small teams of resistance fighters moved swiftly across the city, engaging in skirmishes that made it seem as though humanity was everywhere. The Vraxii forces, eager to crush the human uprising, took the bait. The first wave of attacks came fast, but it was precisely what Ryland had hoped for. The Vraxii were pushing forward, chasing shadows, responding to a force that didn't truly exist. Then, when their focus was entirely on the decoy positions, Ryland's real team struck. Using human ingenuity, they disabled key Vraxii communication nodes, cutting off vital information from their command structure. Without their communication, the Vraxii forces were lost. They couldn't coordinate, couldn't regroup, and as their supply lines began to crumble, they were left scrambling, unable to maintain their overwhelming assault. The Vraxii didn't know what hit them. Confusion spread through their ranks like wildfire. Some of their commanders panicked, issuing orders that made no sense. Others, more experienced but still uncertain, fumbled as they tried to regain control. And in the midst of it all, Ryland's team was everywhere, striking, slipping away, and setting traps that left the Vraxii reeling. By the time the Vraxii figured out they had been outmaneuvered, it was too late. The damage was done. A significant portion of their forces had been scattered, and their resources were significantly depleted. Ryland stood at the head of the chaos, watching the enemy leadership falter. He could see it in their eyes: doubt. The cracks in the Vraxians' infallible facade were showing. "They're losing it," Gravik said as he watched a Vraxia officer fall back, barking orders that no one followed. "I knew they wouldn't last long." Ryland gave a grim nod. They never stood a chance. Despite the chaos, there was a growing sense of triumph among the human forces. The resistance was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. Humanity wasn't simply fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to win. The Vraxian leadership, once so confident in their superiority, had begun to fracture. One faction blamed the other for underestimating humanity, while another sought to double down on their technological advantage, unable to accept that humans could outthink them. Ryland's team continued to push forward, creating a web of deception and misdirection that left the Vraxii more frustrated by the day. It wasn't just that they were losing territory, it was that they were losing their ability to trust their own intelligence. Their technological advantage, which they had used to subjugate countless civilizations, had become their greatest weakness. As Ryland surveyed the battlefield, his mind raced. The Vraxii were beginning to question everything. But Ryland knew that they had one thing the Vraxii could never replicate: the ability to adapt. They could twist their strategy, shift tactics, and think on their feet in ways the Vraxii couldn't fathom. He turned to Rowlick, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning. We've shown them what we can do, but we need to keep pushing." Rowlick nodded, a glint of determination in his eyes. "We'll make sure they regret underestimating us." Ryland stood before the holographic map, watching as his team prepared for their next move. The previous skirmishes had given them a sense of accomplishment, but this next operation was different. It was the first full-scale counteroffensive humanity would launch against the Vraxii, and failure wasn't an option. The tension in the room was palpable, as Ryland's mind raced through every possible outcome, every tactical move. "We know they're vulnerable now," Rallick Dane said, his voice steady. He paced back and forth, eyes locked on the map. We've disrupted their supply lines, weakened their defenses. If we hit them where it hurts, they'll have no choice but to retreat. Rylan nodded, his expression hard. We'll hit them hard, but we can't rely on brute force. The Vraxi have that advantage, and they'll expect us to make a direct assault. That's exactly what they want. We need to outthink them. Gravik's son, sitting near the map, raised an eyebrow. You're not suggesting we try another decoy move, are you? No, Rylan replied, eyes narrowing. This time we'll force them into a trap. It's not a decoy, but they'll think it is. A sudden silence filled the room, broken only by the low hum of the nearby equipment. The strategy was bold, but Rylan had no doubt it would work. The Vraxi had underestimated humanity for too long, and that arrogance was about to cost them. We'll use the terrain, Rylan continued, pointing to the rugged landscape on the map. The hills and the canyons near the eastern front. We'll have the main resistance forces create a false retreat. They'll think they've pushed us back, and then, when they're spread thin, we'll hit their supply depot from the rear. The team exchanged glances, processing the boldness of the plan. It would take precise coordination, flawless execution. One wrong move and the Vraxi would crush them. We'll need a diversion, Rollick said. Something big enough to get their attention. Rylan's lips curled into a grim smile. Leave that to me. Hours later, the battle began. Rylan's forces, positioned in the hills, set off small explosions to simulate the retreat. At the same time, another unit fired off flare rounds from a hidden position, mimicking the sounds of an escaping army. The plan was to make the Vraxi believe that humanity had broken, nothing more than a disorganized, retreating force. The Vraxi took the bait. Their forces surged forward, believing that humanity's remaining troops were fleeing in disarray. They moved aggressively, pushing their machines into the open, leaving themselves exposed. Rylan had known this would happen. He watched as their lines began to thin, moving into the valley where his forces waited. Then, without warning, Rylan gave the signal. The first of his hidden forces launched an attack, hitting the Vraxi from behind. Their tanks exploded in fireballs, their communication lines severed in a split second. At the same time, Rylan's main unit, positioned at higher ground, opened fire with precision, targeting Vraxi transports and dropping supply drops from the air. Everything had been carefully planned to ensure the Vraxi's initial confidence would work against them. The Vraxi were thrown into chaos. They had assumed humanity was cornered and broken. Now they were facing an organized resistance that was using their own arrogance against them. Prepare for Phase 2, Rylan ordered, his voice cutting through the battlefield as chaos unfolded below. We push them back and take the high ground. Do not let them recover. The Vraxi responded with force, but their retaliatory measures were slow. The disarray in their ranks was evident. Their leadership, once calm and confident, began to crack under the pressure. As Rylan had predicted, the Vraxi were more accustomed to overwhelming their enemies with sheer force, not outwitting them at every turn. The humans moved swiftly, using the terrain to their advantage. They set up traps, hit the Vraxi where they were weakest, and closed off their escape routes. The Vraxi tried to regroup, but their communications were scattered and their command structure was unraveling. The fear began to spread. We've got them, Commander, Gravik called out, his voice triumphant over the radio. Their retreat is disorganized. They're falling apart. Rylan took a deep breath, allowing himself a brief moment of relief, but he knew this was just the beginning. The Vraxi weren't beaten yet, but they were close. I want their command post, Rylan said, eyes steely with resolve. Take it now. The next hour was a blur of calculated strikes. The Vraxi tried to retreat, but Rylan's forces were relentless, pushing them back further into the heart of their defensive positions. It wasn't just a victory, it was a blow to the Vraxi's pride, their sense of superiority. For the first time, they saw that humanity was not just surviving, it was thriving, outthinking them at every turn. By the time the battle concluded, the Vraxi were in full retreat. The humans had scored a major victory, but the cost was high. Rylan's team had lost valuable soldiers, and the emotional toll weighed heavy on him. He surveyed the battlefield, watching as the remnants of the Vraxi forces scrambled to regroup. But their morale was shattered, their confidence broken. They had been outsmarted. And now, Rylan knew that the tide had truly begun to turn. The first victory was always the hardest, but now humanity had tasted success. The Vraxii, so sure of their superiority, were on the defensive. Rylan could feel it in the air. The beginning of the end for their invaders. He turned to Raulik, his voice low but filled with determination. "They'll regret underestimating us." Raulik nodded, a grim smile creeping onto his face. "I think they already are." Rylan stood on the ridge, staring out over the landscape. The battlefield stretched before him like a scar across the land, smoke rising from the ruins of what used to be human cities, the remnants of alien machinery scattered like broken toys. Humanity had come a long way since that first devastating betrayal, but the price had been steep. Lives had been lost, and the damage was irreversible in many ways, yet here they were, pushing back. The world felt different now. The hope that had flickered in the early days of the resistance was now burning brightly. Humanity had become a force the Vraxii could no longer ignore. "Commander?" came a voice from behind him. Raulik Den approached, his face drawn, but there was a spark in his eyes. "We've secured the southern sector. The Vraxii are retreating, but it's not over yet." Rylan turned to face his right-hand man, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. "It's never over, but we're not losing anymore." The war was far from won, but the momentum was shifting. Humanity had started to reclaim lost ground, and each victory, small or large, was a reminder that the Vraxii weren't invincible. It wasn't their technology or their advanced weaponry that had given humanity the edge. It was something else, something the Vraxii couldn't quantify: resilience. "I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this up," Raulik said, his voice weary but resolute. "We've had some major wins, but the Vraxii have vast resources. They won't stop until they stamp us out completely." "We don't need to beat them with their own weapons," Rylan replied, his gaze unwavering. "We'll beat them with what we've always had: our ingenuity, our will to survive." Raulik didn't argue. He didn't need to. They both knew it was true. The Vraxii were the epitome of technological superiority. Their fleets had torn through Earth's defenses like a hot knife through butter. But it was humanity's ability to adapt, to think on its feet, to surprise their enemies at every turn, that was slowly breaking the alien empire's resolve. As they moved to the command center to discuss their next steps, Rylan felt the weight of leadership press on his shoulders. He hadn't chosen this path, no one had, but now, with each victory, he found himself more entrenched in this battle than ever before. He wasn't just fighting for Earth anymore. He was fighting for something bigger: the belief that humanity's spirit could overcome even the most powerful adversary. The Vraxii weren't just an invading force. They were a symbol of everything humanity had fought against since its earliest days: oppression, arrogance, the belief that the strong have the right to dominate the weak. And in every battle, in every struggle, humanity's response had been clear: we will not be silenced. The strategy sessions that followed were quick and to the point. Rylan's team had grown, and their collective experience in guerrilla tactics and psychological warfare had made them formidable. Their next move was simple: continue to break the Vraxi's supply lines, further isolate their forces, and never give them a moment of peace. "We hit them here," Rylan said, pointing to the map. "Their fleet is stretched thin, and they're relying on these supply convoys for resupply. If we take them out, they'll have nothing left to fight with." Fisk, the tech expert who had been with them from the beginning, spoke up. "We've been intercepting their communications for weeks now. I'm confident we can disrupt their systems again, at least long enough to catch them off guard." Rylan nodded, appreciating Fisk's quiet confidence. "Good. Let's make sure we keep them guessing. And this time, we take no prisoners." The operation was set into motion. For days, Rylan's forces moved in small, highly trained squads, striking at the heart of Vraxi resupply points. They used the terrain to their advantage, setting up ambushes, hacking alien systems, and leaving false trails to confuse the enemy. Each time the Vraxi thought they had the upper hand, humanity struck from an unexpected angle. The Vraxi were no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed. They had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, to fight back in ways their advanced technology couldn't predict. But now, their leadership was starting to crack. The once unified Vraxi command was splintering. Some commanders were calling for a full retreat. Others were adamant that they could still defeat the humans with sheer force. But doubt had crept in, and doubt was something the Vraxi could never afford. It was humanity's greatest weapon. The tipping point came just days after the latest supply raid. The Vraxi fleet, weakened by the continuous loss of resources, attempted to regroup. But Rylan and his team had one final trap prepared. They led the Vraxi into a canyon that had once been a lifeline, but now had become a graveyard for their forces. Rylan's forces, waiting in the shadows, unleashed a barrage of precisely targeted strikes. The Vraxi, expecting a quick victory, were ambushed and scattered. "Commander, we've done it," Rollick said, a grin spreading across his face as he surveyed the battlefield. "They're retreating." Rylan's heart pounded in his chest. For the first time since the invasion began, he allowed himself to feel something more than duty. He felt triumph. The Vraxi had been forced to retreat. They were not invincible. They had been beaten not by superior firepower, but by human ingenuity. But even as victory seemed within reach, Rylan knew the battle wasn't over. The Vraxi would regroup. They would return with reinforcements. But humanity was no longer on the defensive. Rylan and his people had found their strength. They had tasted victory. And that taste would drive them forward. Rylan Voss stood at the front of the war room, his eyes scanning the digital map of the Vraxi Central Command. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for. A single decisive strike that would break the Vraxi once and for all. But as the final attack loomed, a familiar tension gripped him. The weight of every decision, every loss, hung heavily on his shoulders. The room was quiet, filled with the hum of equipment and the hushed voices of his commanders, each preparing for the battle that would decide the fate of Earth. For the first time, Rylan felt the undeniable weight of leadership not as a burden, but as a force that pushed him forward. They were going to win this, not through superior numbers or technology, but through strategy and heart. "We've come this far. There's no turning back," Rylan said, his voice calm but firm. His eyes met the faces of those around him, Rallick, Fisk, Gravik, and the rest of his team. They had seen everything, destruction, loss, and hopelessness. But now they saw a chance, a sliver of light in the darkness. Fisk, their tech expert, leaned over a console, his fingers moving quickly. "I've hacked into their command systems. They're expecting an attack, but they think it's coming from the east. We'll strike from the north. Right where they least expect it." "Perfect," Rylan replied. "We'll use their arrogance against them. They think they're too powerful to fail. Let's make them regret underestimating us." Alec Den, ever the veteran, nodded. "We've set the traps. Every exit is compromised. Their forces will be trapped before they even know it." Gravik's son, the silent operative, added, "I've already planted the misinformation. The Vraxi are expecting reinforcements to arrive at least 2 hours late. By then, we'll have them." Rylan took one last look at the map. The Vraxi command center, located deep within a mountain range, had been considered impenetrable. They'd tried to breach it before, only to be repelled. But now, the advantage lay with humanity, not in their strength, but in their ability to outthink the enemy. "Everyone knows their part. We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we hit them where it hurts most. Let's show them what humanity is capable of," Rylan said, his voice steady, filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had come to fully embrace his role as a leader. As they moved into position, Rylan couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a battle. It was a statement. The Vraxi had underestimated humanity from the beginning, assuming that their advanced technology and military prowess would guarantee victory. But they hadn't counted on one thing: the unyielding human spirit. The human forces moved swiftly, blending into the shadows of the terrain. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but their strategy was sound. The first wave of decoys sent the Vraxi scrambling, drawing them into the narrow corridors they had prepared. The humans struck from the shadows, taking down isolated outposts with surgical precision. In the chaos that followed, the Vraxi found themselves unable to respond. Phase 1 complete, Rylan reported, his voice steady but his heart racing. The enemy was confused, unsure of where the real attack was coming from. They had been led into a trap, but Rylan knew they couldn't afford to relax. This was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. As the hours passed, the attack continued. Rylan and his team infiltrated the heart of the Vraxi's command center, using their own technology against them. They triggered false signals, set up diversionary explosions, and manipulated the Vraxi's own systems to create confusion. It was an assault of the mind, not just the body. The final blow came when Rylan's forces breached the central command room. The Vraxi, who had once been so confident in their superiority, were now in disarray. Their commanders, who had always relied on their advanced weapons and unchallenged strategies, were scrambling to respond. The Vraxi commander, Threxomaln, stood at the center of his command, his face twisted in disbelief. "How could this be happening?" he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. Rylan's voice came over the comm, cold and decisive. "You never understood us, Threx. You thought your technology would win the war for you, but it was never about technology. It was about us, the human will to survive." The final trap was sprung. The Vraxi forces, already decimated by the earlier strikes, were now completely cut off. Rylan's team had set explosives at every key exit, and the Vraxi were trapped in their own fortress. There was no way out. As Rylan's forces closed in, the once mighty Vraxi Empire crumbled in the face of human ingenuity. The last remnants of the Vraxi fleet were forced to retreat, unable to cope with the relentless assault. Victory had been hard-earned. Rylan stood amidst the ruins, the echoes of the battle still fresh in his mind. The cost of war had been immense, but humanity had prevailed. The Vraxi were defeated not by their weapons, but by the very thing they had underestimated: the adaptability and creativity. The war was over. Earth was free. But as Ryland looked out over the shattered battlefield, he knew that the fight for Earth's future was just beginning. This victory, however sweet, had come at a cost, and there were still those who would try to impose their will on Earth. Humanity had proven itself, but it would need to keep proving itself every day. "Is it over?" Rallick asked, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "For now," Rylan replied, the weight of the moment settling in. "But we've shown them what we're made of, and that's a message they'll never forget." The human spirit had won, and in that victory, Rylan realized something deeper. It wasn't just the survival of Earth that mattered, but the survival of humanity itself. Their ability to fight, adapt, and never back down. As Earth began to rebuild, the galaxy would look at them with new respect. The Vraxi were not the only ones with the power to shape the future. Humanity had earned its place in the stars. The Hume of Earth's communications hub was oddly peaceful in the aftermath of the battle. Commander Rylan Vaugh sat at the console, staring at the holographic map that once tracked Vraxi positions. Now, the map was eerily empty. The Vraxi Empire, which had once seemed an insurmountable force, was reduced to nothing more than a faint memory in the galaxy's history. The war was over. The Vraxi had surrendered. But the victory felt different than Rylan had imagined. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted from weeks of relentless strategy and countless victories. As humanity began to regroup, he realized the price of this triumph. Countless lives had been lost, entire cities turned to ash. The echoes of destruction were not just in the debris scattered across the landscape, but also deep within him. His people had won, but had it been worth the cost? The doors to the war room opened, and Rallick Din entered, carrying a somber expression. "The Vraxi command has issued their formal surrender," Rallick said, handing Rylan a datapad with the terms. The terms were clear. The Vraxi, broken and humiliated, agreed to cease all hostilities and recognize Earth's independence. Their once proud fleet was in disarray, and their leaders had fled, seeking refuge in the far reaches of the galaxy. Earth had crushed them, not with technology, but with sheer will, in the relentless pursuit of freedom. Rylan took the pad, his fingers trembling slightly. This was the moment humanity had fought for, the moment they'd been waiting for. Yet in this quiet victory, there was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The sacrifices had been immense, and many of those who had fallen would never see the dawn of Earth's new era. "I never thought it would end like this," Rylan muttered to himself, staring at the holographic symbol of the Vraxii flag, their emblem now a symbol of defeat. Rallick sighed. "No one did. But we've come a long way, Ryland. We've made them regret underestimating us." Ryland's gaze remained fixed on the hologram, but the weight of their words sunk deep. It wasn't just the Vraxii who had underestimated humanity. It was humanity itself. They'd started this war with no illusions about their odds, but as each victory built on the last, the weight of leadership had begun to change Rylan. He had once been filled with doubt, unsure if he was the right person to lead. Now, that uncertainty was gone. He was no longer just a commander. He was the symbol of humanity's defiance, its will to survive against overwhelming odds. The war had forged a new identity for humanity, one that would no longer be seen as weak or helpless in the eyes of the galaxy. Earth had earned its place not through alliances, not through submission, but through blood, sweat, and ingenuity. Humanity's triumph would be remembered not just for the battle they won, but for the spirit they refused to extinguish. But even in the face of this triumph, Rylan couldn't shake the grief that lingered. He knew that the victory was bittersweet. Earth had won, but the cost had been steep. His thoughts returned to the fallen soldiers, the civilians caught in the crossfire, and the loved ones who would never see the world that had been reborn from the ashes. "How do we move forward from here?" Rylan asked, turning to Rowik. The older strategist looked at him, his eyes soft with understanding. "We build, Rylan. We rebuild, and we make sure humanity's place in the galaxy is not just one of survival, but one of power. We form alliances with the oppressed, with those who still fight for freedom. Our victory has shown the galaxy that humanity is not to be underestimated." Rylan nodded, but the burden of his leadership was far from over. While Earth's independence was secured, there were still many challenges ahead. The galaxy was vast, and the Vraxii were not the only empire with expansionist ambitions. The road to peace would not be simple. But now humanity had the strength to meet those challenges head-on. "Humanity has shown its strength," Rylan said, his voice steady. "But the fight isn't over. We'll need to protect what we've won. We've earned the right to stand alongside the stars, but now we must ensure that no one forgets how we got here." Rallick smiled, though his eyes were heavy with the knowledge of the battles that still lay ahead. "You've become the leader we all needed, Rylan. The leader humanity needed." The door to the war room opened again, and the remaining members of Rylan's command team filed in. The Resistance had become a family, united by the cause of survival. But now their journey together was shifting. They were no longer just soldiers in a desperate fight. They were the architects of Earth's future. They were the ones who would help shape this new era. As the team gathered around Rylan, the atmosphere in the room shifted. There was a quiet sense of pride, but also the understanding that this was just the beginning. They had broken the chains of oppression, but the weight of leadership was now on their shoulders. Earth's rise would not come without challenges. But Rylan knew that humanity had earned this moment. "Let's show them who we are," Rylan said, a new fire burning in his eyes. "Humanity will never again be seen as weak. We fight for our future, for our freedom, and for every life lost in the name of this victory." The room filled with silent nods of agreement. They were united. They were stronger than ever before. The Vraxii had fallen, and in their fall, humanity had risen. Rylan turned to the digital map once more. The Vraxia had surrendered, but their humiliation was not just a defeat. It was a symbol of humanity's indomitable spirit. Earth was no longer a target. It was a beacon. The day Earth had fought so hard for had come. A day not defined by the violence of war or the fear of oppression, but by something greater. The freedom to chart its own course. Commander Ryland Voss stood at the observation deck of Earth's new Galactic Council headquarters, his eyes tracing the stars beyond the planetary atmosphere. The vastness of space had always been a source of awe, but now it felt different. Humanity's place among those stars was no longer uncertain. It had been earned. The Vraxii were gone. Earth was free. His fingers brushed the holographic map of the galaxy, now teeming with signals of human expansion. He watched as alliances began to solidify, not only with other human colonies but with species once oppressed by the very empires that sought to subjugate Earth. Earth's influence was growing by the day, its new position as a galactic power clear to all who watched. Ryland thought back to the dark days, to when the invasion first began, when humanity had no idea how they would survive. And now, here they were, the torchbearers of hope for a galaxy that had long forgotten what it meant to fight for freedom. Rayleigh Dean approached him, holding a data pad. He handed it to Ryland silently. The pad displayed the news: Earth's first diplomatic treaty signed with the Vraxii, a peaceful race once enslaved by the Vraxii. Their leaders had agreed to form an alliance, recognizing Earth as a key player in the galaxy. It was a moment of triumph not just for humanity but for all those who had been oppressed by the Vraxii's iron fist. "It's happening, Ryland," Rawlik said, breaking Ryland from his reverie. "The galaxy is listening. Humanity is making its mark." Ryland nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than just that, Rawlik. We've proven to them that we don't just survive, we thrive. We build, we lead." He paused, his thoughts shifting to the cost of their victory. "But at what price?" Rawlik's gaze softened. "The cost was steep, but you've led us through it. We were nothing but a small, scattered resistance, and now, look at us. We've given hope to the galaxy." Ryland turned to the window once more, his gaze shifting back to Earth. The planet was healing, cities rebuilding, people returning to their daily lives. He had led humanity to victory, but the scars of the war would remain, both on the planet and within himself. He had lost friends, soldiers, and civilians in the fight. The victory was sweet, but the grief was real. But there was also something else. Something that Ryland couldn't ignore. A sense of pride, not just in the victory, but in the people he had fought alongside. They were the ones who had turned the tide, the ones who had refused to bow, who had fought when all seemed lost. They had proven that human spirit, ingenuity, compassion, and resilience was far more powerful than any empire. "We've earned our place here," Ryland said quietly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "But we have to keep earning it. The galaxy won't wait for us to catch up." Rawlik gave him a sidelong glance. "You've always been the one to carry that burden. It's why we follow you. But don't carry it alone. We're here. We've got your back." Ryland met Rawlik's gaze, and for the first time he felt the weight of leadership ease. He wasn't alone. Humanity was no longer just a scattered race of survivors. They were united. They were a force to be reckoned with. And they were not about to let their hard-won freedom slip away. "Let's make sure the Vraxii never have the chance to come back," Ryland said, determination burning in his eyes. The doors to the observation deck opened again, and Gravik's son entered, his face stoic but his eyes filled with pride. "The Yugathi have requested an audience, Commander," he said. "They wish to discuss the terms of a new coalition, and there's more. The Xanthi Alliance wants to meet with us as well. They've heard of our victory." Ryland's chest swelled with pride. It wasn't just Earth's survival they had secured, they had changed the course of galactic history. They had shown the universe that humanity would not be cowed. "I think it's time we show them just how far we can go," Ryland said, a slow smile forming. "We'll work with the Yugathi, the Xanth, anyone who's willing to stand with us. We've proven that our strength lies not just in our military might, but in our ability to unite, to inspire, and to lead. The galaxy won't forget us." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Earth was no longer a target. It was a beacon of hope, a new center of power that would chart a course for the future. Rylan could already see it. Trade routes established, cultural exchanges, and alliances that would strengthen Earth's standing in the galaxy. It was no longer about just surviving. It was about building a future where humanity's voice would be heard. Rallick, Gravik, and Rylan stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars. The battle had been hard fought, but the war was over. Humanity had risen, and its place among the stars had been secured. Earth's future is ours, Rylan said, his voice filled with quiet pride. We are no longer the underdog. We are a force to be reckoned with, and this is just the beginning. The final unspoken message echoed in the silence that followed. Humanity had not only survived, but had triumphed. Against overwhelming odds, against the most powerful empire in the galaxy, humanity had risen and secured its place as a force for freedom and change. The galaxy would never forget the price humanity had paid for their victory, nor the spirit that had carried them to it. Earth's new dawn had arrived, and humanity was finally free to chart its own course. Did humanity's resilience surprise you? What do you think is the most powerful weapon we have against invaders? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.